We are now joined by Mr. Riz Khan. He is an international journalist at Al Jazeera English and a speaker at this year's Gallen Symposium. Mr. Khan, thank you very much for granting us some of your precious time.
It's absolutely a pleasure to be back here again. Really enjoyed being back.
The topic of this year's Gallen Symposium is facing risk. What are the major risks that we, the next generation, will be confronted with within the next decade?
Major risks for you guys? How long have we got? It's going to take a long time to go through those because sadly we've reached a point in the world where there are so many turning points. Issues such as the state of economies in Europe, in America. Emerging markets are different, but then they have different issues. So the state of the global economy is going to have an impact on the way that the next generation has to address sustainable development. The issue of sustainable development in terms of the environment is crucial as well, and it's only really this generation that has started to pay a bit more attention to it in the developed world. Then there's the emerging markets where they want to grow first and think about other things later. You know, people in developing countries, India, China, want to put food on their table and start to develop some kind of consumerism and experience what the West has had, if you like. So, of course, their prime concern is that, and less thought is given to the environmental consequences. So the environment and the way the world is handled as a planet, is a crucial factor. Those are going to be very important. I think there's also the issue of developing a better sense of humanity. Now, this is a little more ethereal in some ways, but the issue of learning that we all have to work towards a mutual goal of, reducing starvation, improving the quality of lives of people around the world. There is a view that we are moving in that direction, but still there are so many people around the world living on less than $1 a day. Middle classes are growing and poverty is being reduced, but not at the scale that we could do it. So I think for the next generation, how to treat humanity as equal as opposed to the have and have-nots is a huge challenge, and one that will really determine how societies merge. We're so interconnected, everyone knows what's going on around the world. So even in poor communities, they see how the rich live. And to avoid that kind of frustration and anger and reaction and rebellion that we see, and we saw those in the riots, for example, in Britain, where people came out on the streets and looted shops, and a lot of it was just thugs and looters, but there was an underlying trend of this: why do they have and we don't have? Occupy Wall Street and all these Occupy movements are an indication of that. I think that's a growing thing, and if the next generation doesn't address the disparity, that's going to be a big factor. And these are just, 2 or 3 of the issues that I'm raising. There's so many things: climate change, which is a result of the environment, a whole bunch of things that you guys are going to have to address.
Having talked to a lot of outstanding and controversial leaders of today, is there a correlation between a person's power and its attitude to risk-taking?
That's an interesting question. Now, there are those who have wielded power like an executive power and have used it and manipulated their companies or their governments in a certain way. An example in the corporate world: Steve Jobs, totally the boss. Everything happened the way Steve wanted it. And of course, that's left the company wondering what's going to happen next now he's gone. On the other hand, at a sort of governmental level, someone like Muammar Gaddafi or Bashar al-Assad, who have been very hard in ruling with very strict rule, not a democratic process, and therefore you see it at corporate and government levels. In those cases, in many cases, people who have power find that they have the ability to move things the way they want to. Sometimes you get like benign dictatorships where people, Lee Kuan Yew, for example, in Singapore was accused of being a benign dictator because he built his country, from scratch, and everyone benefited from it. But I think that in a lot of cases when people have power, it does corrupt, as they say, power does corrupt. And what ends up happening is people find it hard to reach a point where they can mentally and physically transition to another ruler. People don't want to give up power. So the Mugabes and the Gaddafis and all these people, Mubarak, often were forced into these situations. I think there's a danger when people have absolute power that they have the risk of absolute corruption as well.
As an expert on Middle Eastern affairs, will the events of the Arab Spring give rise to stable democracies in that region?
Well, first, I would be critical of anyone who says they are an expert in the Middle East, because it's such a volatile and unpredictable place. When the Arab Spring started, I could never have imagined. First thing with Tunisia, I thought Egypt is next, and I think that was obvious to many people. But I didn't expect Bahrain to go the way it went, for example. But I think it's going to be very hard for the Middle East to reach some kind of real, mellow, stable balance until a lot of the underlying issues are addressed. And this goes to the question of what does the next generation face? Do they have the economy to provide jobs? There's a huge amount of joblessness in the Middle East, especially at a time when there's a rising young population. And when you have a lot of people who are unemployed but educated, the frustration factor is very high. Then you have the issue of the Middle East being a very tribal and culturally diverse place. Those in Egypt are very different from those in Saudi. Those in the Levant, in Lebanon and Beirut, in Beirut, Lebanon, for example, are very different from those, say, in Oman. So you have a diversity. That means a balance has to be reached, where there is common goals and common, practices, but each can retain their own culture. The issue of Pan-Arabism is a dream for a lot of people. People say it can't be achieved because of these differences. But having said that, there is so little trade between the GCC countries and the Arab world. There's so little inter-trade between those countries that people say, why, when you have a powerful trading bloc, do you not make the most of it? So there's a lot of adjustments to be made before you get a really sustainable, peaceful, sort of democratic rule across the whole place. But pressure is on, now, on all these leaders to make sure that the people are all moving forward at a good pace.
Could the Middle East go the same way the European Union did? First a trade union, then a Middle Eastern Arab Union?
Well, this is what they've talked about for a long time, that the GCC should have a common currency, for example. I don't know how they're viewing it now they've seen what happened in Europe, because there is that kind of disparity within the Middle East too, but less so than in Europe. And the thing you have in the Middle East is the commonality of language, with the Arabic language, and even if there are different accents and dialects, essentially it's run with the language works across the region, which helps a lot. The culture is a little more similar because of that, and religion, though you have many Christians and Jews as well in the Arab world, you have essentially Islam as quite a unifying force in some ways, and sometimes a divisive force. But I think that it would take some time for them to get the parameters in order to be able to actually have a cohesive union like Europe had.
Looking back at your life, what has been the biggest risk you have ever taken?
Marriage? No, just kidding. No, actually, I think for me, actually, when I look at it, I've been blessed with going with the flow. So even when something seems like a risk to me, I tend to look at it as an opportunity. And I think the biggest change in my life was, wanting to be a doctor from the age of 6 years old and studying so hard in the medical sciences from an early age, even before I had to, and knowing so much and learning so much. Suddenly finding myself becoming a journalist in my postgraduate studies was a big risk. The idea was to save up some money and go back and finish my medical studies because I ran out of grant funding. But it worked out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. And I found my element, as they say. I found the right area for me as a person. Medical studies and the medical world would have been good for me too, I think. But this certainly has been a fantastic experience, and it's given me a chance to see the world. So, it doesn't feel like a risk, but at the time it probably did.
What motivates you to keep on coming back to the St. Gallen Symposium?
Well, I do a lot of conferences. I'm quite sort of picky, but I do quite a few, depending on how my work schedule goes. And I do a lot with the United Nations and with some companies and so on. And I find that St. Gallen is unique in that, it's run by students, and student panel and former students as well. But it's incredibly organized. I mean, that's Swiss character as well for you. It's a beautiful setting, of course. But I think because it's done so well and the content is great, there's an urge to come back every time. And I think it's my 4th or 5th one, and I'm very excited always to come back.
Mr. Khan, thank you very much for your time and enjoy your stay at the St. Gallen Symposium.
It was my pleasure. Thank you, Gary.